Good evening. Good evening. Welcome very, very much to this segment of Conversations, where we're pleased to welcome to the program Ann Ritter. And Ann Ritter is an immigration lawyer here in New York and is the current chairman of the American Immigration Lawyers Association, the New York chapter. And Ann, welcome very, very much to Conversations.
Oh, thank you very much, Harold.
I wonder if maybe you might share for myself, immigration law is a specialized field, but maybe you could share a little bit the association. We talk about it, fix that, and then we talk some about problems of understanding immigration, recent court decisions and so forth. But maybe we could share the association.
Sure.
If you would.
The American Immigration Lawyers Association is a national organization of attorneys who specialize in immigration law. Nationally, we have over 2,000 members, and in the New York chapter, the organization actually started in New York. There are more than 400 practicing immigration attorneys.
Yeah, reflecting the fact that there are tremendous problems and things are changing.
There are enormous problems from the time that I started practicing immigration law, which was in 1974, until the present time. The number of lawyers and the number of problems has multiplied.
Yes,
geometrically.
Geometrically,
yes.
Yeah, it has, because the problem has become, and it can be seen from a couple of standpoints. I mean, our Statute of Liberty does say, give us our huddled masses and so forth, but there are, I guess the basic root problem, or one of the root problems is, there are many, many people who wish to come here to the United States, more than the United States practically could accommodate. We had to change that at some point. We put quotas, but there are a number of people coming here, the number of people coming here illegally. There is the question also of the number of people who would come seeking political asylum from extremely difficult situations that there are out there around the world and so forth. But in some, the problem is that there are more people that want to come here, and we have to figure how can we handle this equitably and so forth.
To give you an idea of what it is, legally we are allowed 270,000 people to immigrate to the United States within our quota system. This is a system that was set up more than 30 years ago. Now, in addition to that, there are the husbands and wives and parents of American citizens. The desire to come to the United States is much greater than that number, and the number of people that might qualify for the quota system is much greater than there are spaces within the quota system. Therefore, very frequently people will come to the United States as visitors or as students and just remain on. They don't want to go home, and they can't qualify under the quota system. They haven't yet gotten married. They don't have a profession that would be able to get them a green card, which is what it's called.
A green card is an immigrant, landed immigrant status?
Well, that's what it's called in Canada.
Oh, sorry. Yes, well, we're here to learn, right, yeah. Right.
Okay, if you can't come here, you get landed immigrant status in Canada sometimes. That's what a lot of the refugees are doing, or trying to do. Yes, the green card means that, and it's not green anymore. At one time it was. It's just a name for proof that you have resident alien status and you're able to live and work in the United States. Now, the number of people that can qualify through normal immigration and the number of visas available through normal immigration is far less than the number of people that want to come. And therefore, people who come over the borders stay, people who come with visitors' visas stay, and refugees who have no way of coming in through restrictive refugee quotas simply come to the United States and try to apply for political asylum once they're able to get here.
Yeah, there would be special consideration given to people who have fled from oppressive or dangerous situations in their home country, that we try to create a special category, a special condition for them outside of the normal quota ratios that
absolutely.
There would be.
The United States has traditionally tried to take in people from countries where there has been political oppression, and but there have always been laws to cover that, but the most recent law was something called the Refugee Act of 1980, which is being focused on in Supreme Court, current Supreme Court decisions. Under the Refugee Act of 1980, people who come from countries from which they can demonstrate they have a well-founded fear of persecution are eligible for political asylum in the United States. Now, political asylum means that, assuming that they don't do anything horrible while they're here, they will eventually be able to become permanent residents of the United States and get their green cards. That's what it's called. Now, the issues that have been before the United States Supreme Court is what are the standards by which one is going to be able to accept these people? You cannot completely adopt a country such as Nicaragua, El Salvador, or wherever in the world where there's an insurrection. Which are the people within those countries that might come here that would be within the laws that we have drafted, and which ones of those really are eligible for the benefits of a law that says you have to be a refugee, you have to have a fear of persecution. Now, in the most recent decision before the United States Supreme Court that was decided, I think, about 2 days ago,
yes,
it was
early
called
March,
Cardozo-Fonseca. There was a lady from Nicaragua who stated that she had a fear of persecution. Now, the issue is that enough, and what is a fear of persecution? If you can, the Immigration Service has historically said that you had to be able to, hopefully not from now on, that you had to be able to prove that you were going to be singled out for persecution in order to be able to get the benefits of political asylum, that you had a clear probability of being persecuted. Now, how does somebody who comes to the United States with very frequently the clothes on his back prove that they're going to be singled out for persecution?
How have they, or how have they done?
Well, there are countries where there really are death lists, and there are people who are able to produce those death lists. But in the normal case, you cannot prove it. And just because your father was killed and your mother was tortured and your brother is in jail, under the clear probability of persecution standard, maybe they're not after you. Now, the standard which the Refugee Act of 1980 set forth says that you have to have a well-founded fear of persecution. Now, this is in harmony with the United Nations Protocol concerning refugees, to which the United States is a signatory. Now, under that standard, if you have a fear of persecution that can be demonstrated by subjective as well as objective evidence, and subjective evidence might be, my mother was killed, my father was killed, my brother was killed, and my sister was killed, and I really think that maybe I'll be killed. That might be enough. Under the other standard, that might not be enough.
So in a certain sense, they've liberalized that.
They have tremendously liberalized it under the Cardozo-Fonseca standard, yes.
And that is likely to affect a number of people? I mean,
well, sure, because those people that cannot prove that they're on a death list because they can't get the death list, although they may be, that's in Central America, these lists, they're called death lists.
Yes, right. Or other parts of the world, too. There are political
there are lists and there are political realities. In certain areas of the communist bloc countries, if you speak out against the government, you'll be put in a retraining camp, to retrain your mind, or you may be put into an actual jail. They usually prefer to call the jail something like retraining camps.
How many people over the years, and I wonder, there's a number of questions we want to raise, over the years, say from 1980 when that act was enacted and so forth, how many people have there been who have come to these shores, to the United States, seeking political asylum and declaring that they would be at risk if they were to return to their home country and so forth? Do we have broad general numbers on how many people are involved in this, let's say, beyond the normal
I'm sure that the immigration
quota system and so forth, people that are in a dire situation in terms of political or other kinds of persecution? It may be hard to get
those numbers. Those numbers may exist, but I really don't know who they are, what they are. But I'm sure that the numbers of people that have made themselves known to the Immigration Service are far less than the numbers of people who would make themselves known if they knew that they could get better treatment.
Now, could you have a number of people who just want to come here in the normal sense of being wanting to come to the United States for, I don't know, material, whatever reasons they might have come here, claim political
that's a major
problems,
problem.
and
that's a major problem.
They would be able to get past the quota system that way. So, is that a problem that has to be addressed by?
It's a tremendous problem. There are many countries that have terrible standards of living where there's no opportunity for even the worst of employment, and these people are going to starve. They can't feed their families, they can't feed themselves, they can't find any opportunity for anything at all.
We have a major problem with our neighbor to South Mexico. There's a tremendous overflowing of the Rio Grande River.
There are places where things are worse than they are in Mexico.
Indeed, yes, I know. But I mean, that's
Mexico looks like a paradise to some of the people that come to the United States. Now, from these countries, Central America, sometimes the motivation for coming might be economic. It might have nothing to do with politics. The person may be perfectly integrated into the government, as a matter of fact, might believe in the government in power, might have no problem. However, can't feed the family, can't find a job, starving to death. And those are the people who do not fit into the criteria set forth under the immigration laws.
Under
the immigration law. Under the immigration laws as refugees.
Oh, I see. Right.
However, if they don't fit into the criteria set forth in the quota system, which means that they're husbands and wives of permanent resident aliens, professionals who have employers who may wish to employ them in professional positions and they can't find American citizens to fill these positions, for instance, nurses, technical people for whom there would be a job in the United States for which we are not educating enough people within the normal course of things, for instance, cabinet makers, specialty cooks, things like that. Many of these people don't fit into these categories. They just don't fit in. What are they going to do? They come here and they're not going to say, I'm here because I can make a better living. If they happen to come from a Central American country or they happen to come from certain areas of the communist bloc, they're going to say, I'm here for political reasons and hope that they can get by.
So then that's a question that has to be...
And that is the problem of the Immigration Service, because although we're trying, the government is trying to bring in people that, or to allow to remain people that fit into the laws, some of the people will give will have fraudulent claims.
Yeah. Is there an interpretation of political danger, as it were, back in the home country being done on ideological grounds? If there's a country that, at a geopolitical level, is supposedly friendly, unquote, to the United States, that there's going to be less likelihood that they're going to allow political prisoners of that regime, political opponents of that regime that the United States is supposedly friendly with, than they would be in a communist bloc country where they could then make ideological hay out of the you understand what I'm saying? And is that a problem, the interpretation at a political level? And the politicization of the Immigration Service, as it were?
I mean, just think about it. Here it is that we are trying to develop a relationship with a country which might be the only country that supports the United States in an area that's completely surrounded by communist bloc countries.
Or just unfriendly countries.
Or unfriendly countries.
More and more unfriendly countries, yeah.
Perhaps a situation at home is not wonderful, but the political situation is, if we say you are torturing all your citizens, this might upset a political relationship that we might have with the head of state. And that country may no longer be a friendly country in an unfriendly area where we need a friendly country. That's one of the matters that the State Department has to consider, because whenever there is an application for political asylum, it goes to the State Department for an opinion. Now, the opinion not only covers what is happening in that country, but also could include what the political implications of saying that all the people from a certain country really are being tortured, threatened, jailed, having horrible things done to them, hanged.
Yeah, right. Yeah, well, yeah, we have hospice move, or not hospice, but...
at the same time that we're trying to shake hands in Washington and say, you know, we'll give you grain if you give us whatever it is that we want from you.
And there's also political opposition, often, increasingly, particularly in Central America, Nicaragua, Indonesia, El Salvador, some of these countries, there's opposition here within the United States to that. There are certain church people giving refuge to people who are escaping regimes that we support, because in the parts of some of these people, they see the regimes we support as oppressive. And
yes.
So it makes it politically tricky and so forth.
It's a very politically tricky situation. Here we're trying to sometimes maintain a relationship with a country where we well know what is going on, but we cannot openly say it. Or the government, I'm not saying we, but the government won't openly say it.
And we've done programming here on this series, conversations on the question of Arab Americans, or Arabs here in the United States. 12 Palestinians have been picked up in California, there are cases coming up. There's a politicization of the immigration service. There's under the Immigration Act or under the immigration laws of the country, there's a camp being created, an internment camp in the South. How far along it is actually, I don't know. But the political implications of the immigration laws and immigration services is something that in the name of civil liberties and civil rights, the American citizenry should be, and the court system should be aware of the implications of the possible violations of civil liberties by the immigration services. And is this something that there are people that are concerned with? There are Arabs, I know, certainly have been picked up, and there's been a concern of an anti-Arab animus emanating here in the country. But
yeah, I think that
it's a civil liberties and a human rights violation possibilities.
I think that in this idea, it's an idea that's, in this case, it's an idea that's been taken too far. The United States is, or the government wishes to be sure that the terrorist activities that are going on in other parts of the world don't start to occur with frequency in the United States. However, to just at random or by plan, which is worse, go and arrest every Palestinian saying you're a terrorist, or everybody,
certain Arab states,
yeah, or everybody that has a subscription from an Arab bookstore, maybe that's his native language, or
yeah, that's right,
and to use that information to single out a certain group of people who may well be very supportive of the United States government, I think, is wrong, and it's violating their civil liberties. I mean, here, many of them are here as permanent residents, even as U.S. citizens.
Or they might even hold
as U.S. citizens.
Or they might even hold political views. I mean, there are people within the Palestinian community who would be likely to be anti-Israeli in their thinking, being Palestinian and so forth, and we're supposed to be able to hold different kinds of views without having that.
Well, that's why I say it's an idea that's been taken too far.
Because it becomes
in the fear,
in
the fear of terrorism, they've taken it to the point of, and that's one of the terrible things about living in the communist bloc countries. You cannot talk about anything without going to jail if it's anything that's against the government in power. Well, in its fear of having terrorists become active in the United States, I mean, the people that are going to be terrorists are not those that are talking about their views. They are usually undercover.
Yeah, and it's also hasn't been any of that sort of thing much going on.
They're usually undercover, and they're arresting the people who may have legitimate philosophical points of view, which in this country, traditionally, we've been allowed to air.
Yeah, and if we get to one point where we don't allow those things to be done because it's beyond the pale or something, we're in danger of the whole structure of civil liberties, because it'll begin to affect others. We did do that in the Second War, to our chagrin, with the Japanese, I think. There were,
well, the Japanese situation was altogether different.
We were at a declared war with a nation, but still there was reasons on the part of many to dissuade or to disallow that activity that did take place. And there have been other cases, too. There the hysteria, the anti-communist hysteria of the 1950s. And some of these things are the outgrowth of the McCarran Act. The McCarran Act is tied in on an immigration basis. There's a particular tie between the McCarran Act of the 50s
under the McCarran Act, we have a right to exclude people who we feel would be politically dangerous. Now, the issue is, what is dangerous? Is somebody who's going to come here to make a speech about what goes on in his country, and that maybe air a problem. Maybe air a problem. Is that a dangerous person?
Yeah. And they have been disallowing certain people, even people of great intellectual import on a world scale and so forth, have not allowed them to enter this country on politicized grounds that have been brought into question by a number of people. That is, use of the Immigration Service for access of information to the American citizenry and so forth, because there's an ideological basis on the part of an administration, is a problem. The Immigration Service has a long-term tradition in terms of this country, and it can come and go with administration, but it can become overly politicized in order to drum up a certain kind of psychology in this country, and that could be detrimental to the long-term constitutionality of the system. At least it seems to me a number of people are concerned with that. Are you encouraged by the recent Supreme Court decision that was just announced this week?
Oh, I'm tremendously encouraged. I think that a lot of people who have cases that were difficult to prove under the old standard will be able to prove their cases under the new standard, and I mean, those people that should have gotten political asylum or should be able to get political asylum will be able to get political asylum because they really have a well-founded fear of persecution. This I think this is wonderful. I think it's a long time in coming because the Refugee Act of 1980 is 1980, and this is now 1987, but better late than never.
Yeah, this is a Supreme Court decision, a Supreme Court
yes,
ruling.
Yes, United States
and
Supreme Court.
Is it in accord with the, will there be opposition to the intent, or the, do you feel, there be opposition in the intent and the direction that the court is indicating where our the immigration services to go? Do you think there will be people within the immigration service who feel that the intent of the court decision is one that runs counter to that job that they're trying to carry out? It's going to make their job more difficult, sorting these things out, and particularly given the politicalization of that immigration service activity. Do you think there'll be opposition? Where will the opposition to the thrust of the Supreme Court decision come from, do you think, within the American
Well, the immigration
or the
service
immigration bureaucracy
has traditionally tried to decide these cases on a much more stringent standard, as I said before, clear probability of persecution, which is a lot more objective. Now, over here you have a much more subjective standard, and you're asking a judge to actually be a judge. So that makes the job either more interesting or more difficult, depending upon who you are. But there are people that think that a lot of people that don't really, that really aren't deserving of political asylum might slip through. I favor that rather than keeping out somebody who might get killed if he went home.
Yeah, it's a terrible thing.
I think it's better to err on that side.
Or even killed, or badly persecuted.
Sure.
I mean, it doesn't necessarily have to result in death.
I think it's better to err on this side. So if one guy that really fears that he's going to be killed really won't be killed if he goes back to his own country, so what? Because if there is a chance that he might be, I'd rather have him here than being sent home.
Do you think that this will result in more people being here in that status of seeking political asylum? There will be greater numbers of people now? In great numbers? Can you see a really large-scale increase in the number of people claiming political asylum?
Well, in order to be able to claim political asylum, you have to be able to get across the borders, and I believe that there's been increasing patrolling at the borders. You've got to be able to get in. Political asylum is an application that you make once you're in the United States, and it's becoming increasingly difficult for people to get into the United States, so there may not be an increase. However, you may have a side effect. In the Southwest, there were people that were convicted of harboring Salvadorians.
Yes,
now, the Salvadorians, under the old standard, the church people, under the old standard, maybe they couldn't have qualified. And under the new standard, maybe they can, and maybe it won't be necessary to harbor them anymore because they may be able to qualify under the new standard. That would be really nice.
That would make it a lot easier than some of these people.
It would make it a lot easier for everybody.
They actually had jail terms meted out to some of these church people that have harbored?
Well, no. Nobody got a jail term. It's all suspended.
Right. Yeah, right. There has been suspended. But there was, the intent of the government was to forestall that, and so it's changed. The court has brought a reinterpretation of what the government was attempting to have be the case here in the United States. Will there be do you think there will be an objection on the part of the administration in general to this thrust in terms of the immigration law?
Obviously, they did object. They argued against it. They did their best. They took it up to the United States Supreme Court. Of course they object, but it happens to be the law now. Now, the problem is you have a bunch of words that a bunch of ordinary people have to interpret. So what we really have to worry about is whether or not the people that are now charged with determining what a well-founded fear of persecution is really understand what they're supposed to be doing. And they may think that they understand it, that really well-founded fear means exactly what they always thought it meant, which is something else.
How is it going to
That's where your problem is.
Right. And now for the lawyers and the people who are concerned with these immigration lawyers, back again to the association and so forth, this is going to make the work, as it were, in a certain sense, I don't want to use overly work terms, but easier. It's going to make it new opportunities for them to be able to do things that they've had difficulty in doing and serving. That, do you understand what I'm saying? You are encouraged as a lawyer, and your colleagues would be, that this is going to make the work easier to find?
I now don't have to produce a death list. It's nice. It's nice not to have to produce a death list. When you have somebody that you feel, I had a case myself that I argued before the United States Supreme Court, but it was on a different issue. It was on withholding of deportation. Now, most people who apply for political asylum are also eligible for withholding of deportation, and there the standard has remained to be the more stringent one of clear probability of persecution. With withholding of deportation, it simply means you're not going to be sent back to your own country, but you're not given the benefits of political asylum. The benefit of political asylum is that eventually you can get a green card and you can stay forever, whereas withholding, if the government were to change, you could be sent back.
Oh, I see, yeah, right. And there is going to bring up this question of the interpretation of which of the governments around the world are, quote-unquote, friendly or are,
well, no,
not friendly is the wrong term, but are tyrannical or something of that sort, or would be a threat to where political asylum would be a just a consideration.
Well, technically
and that political problem of how we see the world, because in so many cases our friend, our freedom fighter is somebody else's terrorist and vice versa, and it's a very confused kind of world.
It's extremely difficult. You don't really know who's in and who's out.
Yeah.
And it really doesn't concern that, because if you're, it shouldn't concern that. Now, until 1980, the law was that if you came from a certain area of the Middle East, in other words, you were a Palestinian, or if you were from one of the communist bloc countries, all you had to do was to apply for permanent residence. And there was a provision in the law at that time, before the Refugee Act, that certain areas of the world were singled out for our protection. That went out with the new Refugee Act. Now, under the Refugee Act, you can be from anywhere, as long as you have that well-founded fear of persecution, and there's something going on in your country, and you are going to be the one that you feel that you're going to be one that's going to be affected by that. Now, not everybody, even if they have that, can get political asylum. It's still discretionary with the judge. I read a few newspaper articles, and they're worried about the discretion. A judge might not exercise his discretion and grant political asylum, even if everything is there, if the guy turns out to be a persecutor himself.
I see.
In former times, that would be like a Nazi.
Yeah, that's right.
Or even now, if they're, or who turns out to be a criminal, or turns out to be, you know, in a category of people that no matter what, we don't want them here.
Yeah, right.
But most of the people, and this is the area where you have a real problem, or who have committed serious fraudulent acts. For instance, several years ago, a bunch of Afghans came here and they destroyed their Pakistani passports on the way to the United States because they felt that they could be deported with them, or you know, they came with a whole pack of fraudulent documents. Now, they can be granted withholding of deportation, which is mandatory, because they can't go back to Afghanistan.
Yeah.
But they are not eligible for political asylum because of the fraudulent act, and even under the new interpretation, they would not be eligible, even though they might have the well-founded fear of persecution. So it becomes very complicated.
Indeed, I can see that it does. We've only been able to scratch the surface, but it's an extremely important subject, and there's going to be a great deal more in the news. The implications of it is going to be very profound in terms of this country, and we could go on talking for hours, but I'm sorry we've run out of time for this segment.
Okay.
It's been a great pleasure, right? And I remind you in the cable audience, it's been your pleasure to have the Perceptions in of Ann Ritter, who again is the chairman of the American Immigration Lawyers Association, New York chapter. Here, happy to be able to bring you her perceptions, and we do invite you to stay tuned. There'll be more coming up in the same general topic area momentarily. I'm afraid that's it for this particular segment. We're coming right back, and once again, thank you very, very much indeed.
You're welcome,
for everything. Coming right back. Please stay tuned. Welcome very, very much to this segment of Conversations, where we're pleased to welcome to the program Marla Kamiya. And Marla Kamiya is the Director of Policy Studies, or Director of Public Policy, with the Center for Immigrants' Rights here in New York. And Marla, welcome very, very much to Conversations.
Thank you.
We do want to talk particularly about the immigrant questions that are rising, coming in the consciousness now with Simpson-Rodino and so forth. But I wonder, you have been with the Center for some time, and you have a sense of history, having studied history in your academic and so forth. Maybe you could fill us in a brief way the history of the policy of immigration as far as this United States of America is concerned. We are a nation of immigrants, and the attitude that we've had as a nation toward the immigrant question has changed somewhat historically. Maybe you could just fill in a thumbnail way the history of it, and then bring it up to date. We could talk about some of the questions that continue to be of concern in that area. But maybe you could share a little of the broad brushstroke way, the history of immigration in this country.
Yeah, I think that's a good place to start, because I think the only way really to understand the most recent immigration law is by understanding the some of the larger factors that have shaped U.S. immigration policy. So I think we have had a very contradictory policy. On the one hand, we are a nation of immigrants. The country couldn't have been built without immigrant labor. Yet at certain times in this country's history, very anti-immigrant and restrictionist policy has been passed. And I think it's often a reflection of the economic situation at that particular period, and it's also a reflection of, I think, certain patterns of racism and discrimination towards people of color here. So I think the contradictory character of immigration policy actually began right in the beginning of the founding of the United States, where on the one hand, people were needed in the U.S. There was a vast continent of land. The new settlers here from Europe were trying to figure out a way to develop the economy. In a lot of ways, the need for labor was settled by slavery.
Yes, yeah.
And but a very interesting act was passed right after the Bill of Rights was signed, actually, called the Alien and Sedition Act,
Indeed,
which was the first time we saw immigration policy being used in a political way. They
right
were basically right from the beginning.
Yeah.
So they were very concerned that possibly immigrants from Ireland were radicals, dissidents, would threaten, certain established interests. And this act was passed which said that people with views that could threaten the well-being of the United States could be barred.
All those anarchists.
Right.
Yeah, that's right.
So that was, I think, a first significant juncture. In a lot of ways, I think through the 1800s, the U.S. was in a period of very rapid expansion across the continent. And immigrants were needed. Their labor was needed. And I think an interesting point to remember is that that expansion across the continent actually meant seizing a large portion of Mexico, territory that belonged to Mexico, claiming it for the United States. And I think that's a point we often forget when we talk now about Mexicans invading the United States.
Yeah.
In many ways, they're coming into a territory that was once actually Mexico's.
Yeah, that's true.
But I think the point at which immigration policy begins to take on a very restrictionist character is actually in the late 1800s. And the economy is starting to reach a certain point of the expansion can no longer continue so rapidly. There is a number of severe recessions in the late 1880s, 1890s. And the Chinese are the first targets of an anti-Chinese exclusion act.
That's interesting.
Which bars Chinese from entering the United States.
And that was enacted at the same year that the Statue of Liberty was put up
Right,
in New York
around
Harbor saying, send your huddled masses?
Precisely, right.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the what's very ironic is that the Chinese had played a key role in bringing this country together and building the railroads,
Sure.
in mining and agriculture. But the unemployment that was beginning to emerge at that time found a very handy scapegoat in blaming the Chinese. So unfortunately, it wasn't just whatever the wealthy or the government, but it was the labor movement also playing a significant role in targeting the Chinese.
So they were worried about people coming in to take the jobs of good Americans, as they would say
Precisely,
then, and
right.
that sort of thing. And
Right.
that problem continues, I suppose.
So it's an interesting historical fact is the Union label was actually first a label to distinguish white products from Chinese products.
Interesting.
Right.
Fact, huh?
So I think that's an unfortunate part of
Yeah.
labor history, and certainly there's a long history of, I think, very united labor struggles of both immigrant and U.S. Workers coming together. But that was the character of the political climate in the turn of the century. The Anti-Chinese Exclusion Act was followed by legislation which barred the Japanese, who were initially used to replace Chinese laborers. But as the Japanese began to show that they could become small farmers, open up small shops, I think certain interests in the United States felt very threatened, and Japanese immigration was cut off. Filipinos were brought in to replace the Japanese, and Filipino immigration was later cut off. So in 1924, a very significant immigration act was passed, which actually codified a very discriminatory immigration quota, almost completely barring immigration from Asia and giving a very disproportionate number of shares to Europe. So an effort to establish a more white character to immigration.
That's interesting.
Was
There's
a very
been this
explicit
racist
part
quality to the immigration. Yeah, all right.
The other thing I think we saw in the 1900s then is beginning to use immigration policy to go after political dissidents, and that was often very arbitrarily defined. So the a level of anti-communist hysteria that swept up a lot of people who...
Into the 1950s now, are you talking already?
In the 1920s.
Oh,
there
in the
was
20s.
the Palmer raids.
Yes, right, of course. Right, yeah.
So that was a use of immigration law to pick up people who were viewed as dissidents, who simply had maybe a different viewpoint than the dominant viewpoint. And they were deported, imprisoned, and that was, I think, a very negative feature of immigration policy that emerged during that period. And I think we see it being used today with the arrests of the Palestinian activists in Los Angeles. So that's really nothing new.
There's nothing new in that, right?
And in the 1950s, at the height of the McCarthy era, we saw the McCarran-Walter Act passed, which was a way to, again, try to utilize immigration policy to go after political dissidents. So that's a very negative picture that I've painted out of immigration policy. But I think it's important for us to be aware of it. It's often obscured. In 1965, I think in a very positive way, U.S. immigration policy was liberalized. And I think it's important to remember what the context was for that. There was a very powerful civil rights movement, a sense that inequality had been part of the U.S. legacy, and that corrections needed to be made.
The legacy of immigration policy, there had been
discrimination against minorities, against people of color.
Yes.
And the 1965 Immigration Act opened up immigration again. That's the point at which many people began to come here from Asia.
It opened up immigration on a more general pattern in terms of all areas of the world, rather
on
than
a more
having
equal basis.
European bias that had been characteristic of before that. Okay, interesting,
And then there was also a period, the 1960s was a period of relative economic prosperity.
Yes.
So I think what we see now in 1987 with the passage of Simpson-Rodino is the culmination of about a 10-year process that began under the Carter administration, which again is following the 1970s period of economic recession and difficulty, where the mentality began again that somehow immigrants are taking American jobs, immigrants are bad for the United States, we have to figure out a way to keep them out. Those are the discussions that started under the Carter administration.
So there was a movement then from, let's say, 1960 to the late 1970s up into the beginning of Mr. Reagan's administration to generally close down the total numbers of people that were going to be allowed or change the pattern of those who would be allowed into the United States. Have the total numbers been decreased that would be allowed or not? I mean, no.
Simpson-Rodino did not affect the overall quotas.
Okay.
In earlier versions of Simpson-Mazzoli, it was called back in the early 70s. Right. There was efforts to change the overall quotas. But what Simpson-Rodino does is, the centerpiece of Simpson-Rodino is a provision called employer sanctions, which would fine employers who hire undocumented workers. And that's based on the rationale that undocumented workers are displacing American workers, and employers who hire them should be punished, and as a disincentive to hiring undocumented. So I think a big concern that at the center we have about that is that the basic premise behind Simpson-Rodino, behind employer sanctions, is a false premise that undocumented workers are stealing American jobs. You know, that's an assumption that has never been proven by any academic research. In fact, I think think tanks have come out with the opposite conclusion.
That they're actually serving.
They're actually helping the American economy. They've revitalized the hotel and restaurant industry here in New York. They have been the backbone of the agricultural economy and the economy in general in the Southwest. So in terms of the hard reality, it's very difficult to say that undocumented workers are the source of unemployment.
I see.
And I think it's a very simplistic solution.
Yeah, that would be the scapegoating rationale in a certain sense, to keep down the numbers because they're coming here. There is the general question of we are a nation of immigrants, and we do have the Statue of Liberty in New York Harbor. We have that tradition. But there is the question, in a certain sense, of great numbers of people around the world, particularly, like, say, the Mexican border, and particularly in the South, great numbers of people around the world outside the United States would want to come here to the United States, presumably in large reason because of the material advantages that there are to this country. And it is a necessary step that the United States government takes to keep the numbers of people that are able to come here limited, because there are far more people that would want to come here than could be allowed to come here in the interest of the United States. That's a basic premise that has to be addressed? Or?
Yeah, I think in one way that's true. Some of the supporters of anti-immigrant legislation greatly exaggerate the number of people coming into the United States.
Or
so this vision of the hordes just
mm-hmm.
Waiting at the border, swarming into the United States has been conjured up by a lot of fairly skilled propagandists.
Yes, all right.
And then I think, again, in terms of the number of immigrants in the United States, it's really not massively expanding. I think it's just climbed a couple percentage points in the last number of years. So at one level, it's not true that there's millions of people just waiting to pour in the minute the gates are
that's a little
open.
Xenophobic or chauvinistic.
But I think what is true, is that people do want to come to the United States from countries that are impoverished, where there's military dictatorships, where there's a war going on. And I think our view is that you can't look at immigration as a policy question that will be resolved simply by starting at the borders. You really need to look at the broader picture. We need to look at changes in U.S. foreign policy, for instance, that have often exacerbated the reasons that people come here. For instance, in El Salvador, it's certainly no secret that the United States is backing the Duarte government that has poured an incredible number of dollars into conducting bombing raids over El Salvador, into equipping a huge military force that's conducting a war against the civilian population. And that's the reason that we have a lot of Salvadorans coming to the United States.
And it might be good to mention at that point that on an international scale, each nation would have some immigration policy as to who is going to be allowed in to become citizens and so forth. But on an international scale, there's certain standards that are generally understood. But the United States in general has a highly politicized view of who it will allow to come into the United States, and tends to favor those who are supposedly the enemy or refugees from an enemy state, a communist state, Eastern Europe, could be able to come here much easier than some government which might be equally repressive but is supposed to be a friend of the United States at the governmental level. And that's a problem area. It's a highly politicized kind of view of the use of immigration. Is that a problem as far as the United States is concerned?
Yeah, that's a big problem. That's one of the issues that the center has focused a lot of attention on. So we have a large Salvadoran community, a somewhat smaller Guatemalan community of people who have faced an incredible level of terror, who have seen members of their family tortured, who've had their father or mother disappear overnight, and have fled here in fear of their lives.
Yeah, true political refugees.
Right, and they have applied for political asylum, yet are routinely turned down by the State Department.
Because that would reflect badly on a government that the government of our government that might be repressive in real terms, but we do support them, and that's a real problem, right? So we have the sanctuary movement in a certain sense, and people who have attempted to help these people.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think as well as the sanctuary movement, there is a number of attorneys of civil liberties organizations, immigrant and refugee rights organizations who are trying to defend those who are seeking political asylum. I think Simpson-Rodino is having an extremely negative effect on the Central American community here.
It is.
Because for the most part, that community came here after 1982, so they're not eligible for the small legalization program within Simpson-Rodino. And what this community is the community then that is finding extreme difficulty in keeping their jobs or finding new jobs because of employer sanctions. The Simpson-Rodino law increased the INS enforcement capacity
Sure,
So
yes.
the ability of the INS to conduct raids, to conduct arrests, to
Such as
deport
they've been
people.
doing, such as they have been doing against the Arab peoples in this country in a sort of anti-Arab drumbeat, xenophobia that's
Right.
developing in an alarming dimension in this country, even down to where under the McCarran Act provisions there's a camp supposedly been set up down in the South to
Right.
house these people and so forth. It's going to be pretty frightening.
Right.
Act of aggressive policy, use of the immigration service as a political arm in a sense.
Right.
Yeah.
The I think you're referring to the Oakdale
Yes,
Detention
indeed.
Center
Yeah,
in Louisiana,
yeah.
which is constructed in a very isolated part of Louisiana. It's not near a metropolitan area that would have attorneys or civil rights organizations, and it's a place where Salvadorans can be kept, where Palestinians, other communities that are viewed as undesirable for whatever political reason.
And under the McCarran Act, constitutional rights are suspended and so forth in terms of the supposed internal threat to domestic security.
Right.
Yeah.
People can be detained with, very little cause, and they can be detained indefinitely.
Yeah.
In a certain sense.
Very much like what they used to call, well, it's an overworked term, concentration camps with barbed wire and so forth, and it's rather alarming to a number of people that this should be developing here with a certain kind of attendant hysteria upon the anti-Arab, calling that terrorists and that sort of thing. Yeah. But anyway, that's one aspect of the overall threat and problem in terms of the immigration. It's the politicization of the immigration service and their view within the overall governmental process. Yeah.
Right. So I think in New York, the Simpson-Rodino is having a very sweeping impact.
Yeah, here in New York particularly, this is a city of immigrants within a nation of immigrants, isn't it?
Right. So 1 out of 4 people is an immigrant, was born in another country. The Office of Immigrant Affairs in New York City has estimated it's approximately 500,000 undocumented people in New York. So any kind of change in immigration policy has a big impact. And at the center, we're getting a lot of stories of people who have been fired without reason. The employers are simply afraid they're going to be fined, and they're arbitrarily firing immigrant workers. And what they overlook is that within Simpson-Rodino, there is a protective clause that says employers will not be fined for undocumented workers that they hired before the bill was signed, which was November 6th.
Yeah.
But a lot of people who were hired before November 6th are getting fired because employers don't know the law. Employers are also harassing Puerto Ricans because they think, people are, Latino, speak with an accent possibly.
Right.
These people, who are the U.S. citizens, are getting targeted for, all right, show me your documents. If you don't bring your documents, I'm going to have to lay you off tomorrow.
Yes, right.
And this kind of harassment is just one, part of what employer sanctions means. And I think we're going to see that kind of harassment and discrimination increasing rather than decreasing.
And you said before that this kind of anti-immigrant sentiment within the country usually emerges out of a condition where there are economic difficult times or something of that sort. People feel that these people coming in are going to take over the jobs of legitimate citizens, to use the quotes and so forth. But we live in a time right now in the United States, a little odd and hard to understand. We don't live in a time like the 1930s or a time of, even at this time of even a recession. We live in the longest established bull market in the history of the United States. Mr. Reagan will say that the country is moving very, very rapidly ahead. Things are moving ahead. And yet there is a sentiment there reflecting a sense of economic insecurity on the part of the people in the United States, which is reflected in the attitude that is allowed in terms of this immigration. How can we account the fact that the country seems to be doing well, and yet we still have this restrictive attitude, or is it worthwhile addressing that issue? Why this psychology is emerging so strongly now? Is it politicized, propagandistic,
I think
consciousness raising on the part of the government, or how can we account for it?
I think, I think it's certainly in President Reagan's interest to say the economy is doing extremely well.
Yeah.
I think in New York there is high unemployment rates, especially among minority youth. I think it reaches up to 30–40%.
That's true.
And that's an explosive situation. We may not be in a Great Depression like in the 1930s, but I think it is a period of rising unemployment still that's leading to shutdowns of factories. U.S. manufacturing firms are picking up and moving into the Dominican Republic or into Mexico or into other underdeveloped countries. So there is a problem of unemployment, and I think there is a decline in the overall standard of living for many people.
Yeah, there has been a
Social services are being cut back. I think the infant mortality rates are still on the increase, not on the decrease in New York City.
Yeah, I know. It's
and so I think that there is economic difficulty. And blaming immigrants for economic difficulty is one factor that has shaped Simpson-Rodino.
Classic scapegoating.
Right. I think a second thing, though, is that the United States also is afraid that as military intervention increases in Central America, there will be more people coming from Central America trying to escape the war.
Trying to escape our war.
Right. And then the borders are getting shut down, to stop people from fleeing a problem that we created.
Yeah.
I think the United States is very aware that the Mexican economy is not too healthy, and there is a very large shared border. Again, we feel, though, rather than taking the attitude of, well, let's close down the border, we need to look at how can U.S. Involvement in the Mexican economy
help
rather than hurt the economy, or rather than destabilize the economy. So I think there's been a lot of controversy about the IMF debt and the extent to which the U.S. can control the interest that various Latin American and Caribbean countries are being forced to pay on this debt.
Yeah, a lot of these problems arise out of our inappropriate or lack of appropriate policy on the part of this gigantic colossus of the North. In other parts of the world, we create these problems that come into our borders in the form of refugees very often. That's something we probably would not want to face because it has a view of the United States that it doesn't exactly have us standing tall, as the President would have us do. That's not all well. And the economic might be benefiting certain people at the higher or upper classes, as it were, but the battles and the fights go on with people who are at the lower level of the economic spectrum in the United States, and the things are difficult there. And that's where the immigrants would clash with people who feel as though their interests might be thwarted by more people coming in. So it would be, in a certain sense, a classic scapegoating pattern. Are you at all optimistic in terms of the prospects for, let's say, immigrant policy or addressing the problems of immigrant problems that confront the United States as we begin to look ahead? It's not a particularly bright picture now, but I just wonder generally how you feel in a longer-term perspective. We were trying to get a historical perspective on it, or what some of the pathways might be to a more enlightened policy.
Yeah, I think in the immediate, it's not a very bright picture. That's true, because Simpson-Rodino is just starting to be implemented. But I think in the long term, I think within the United States there is a legacy of civil rights struggle, of a struggle for equality, and I think that's the legacy we draw on to try to protect immigrants' rights, and to have the protection of immigrants' rights be recognized as a very legitimate civil rights issue that has, very rapidly come to the fore in the 1980s.
Yeah, it has indeed, and it certainly has. And the Center itself, the Center for Immigrants' Rights, was started back in 1980 or so. Something maybe you're with the Center. Maybe you share when that got started about in the 1980s. Could see some of these things coming and has addressed those issues.
Right.
So that was an appropriate development, so that it is seen as part of a broader civil rights view, and there are people who can rally to that. Many people who, we are, again, a nation of immigrants. There are many people who, in their conscience and understanding, even though they themselves may be safe, would be able to harken back, not very far back, to where these issues were affecting their families, so there might be able to be a reservoir of appreciation of these problems among the general citizenry. And so we might then call for leadership. Is it a major political issue, do you think, the question of we are coming up to a presidential election and so forth? There are these violations that have been done. I see Mr. Dole met with the Arab American Institute in Washington some time back, even though they had been seen as a pariah group by others. Is it a political issue that could become focus in terms of an appropriate policy in a presidential election sense and so forth, do you think?
Well, I hope that it will be a political issue, and because it needs to be.
Yeah.
There needs to be more debate in a fundamental way about U.S. immigration policy. I think a concern we've had is that it unfortunately was both a Republican and a Democratic effort to get Simpson-Rodino passed. So it's not like there is a clear, more pro-immigrant versus anti-immigrant split between Republican versus Democrat. But I think there's a lot of education that needs to be done within both parties. Hopefully the 1988 presidential election it's certainly a point when political debate is happening.
Yeah, it's interesting in a certain sense when one contemplates, in a historical sense, the United States is a place where so many people want to come with the increasing infant mortality and the fact the United States, which used to be the standard of the world in a material sense, has come down considerably among the other nations. And many other nations of the world have a higher standard of living. Switzerland, other places around the world are surpassing the United States, even in political rights and so forth. The cutthroat competition that is seen by many people here in the United States is making the United States not such an attractive place to be as it has been in the past, or seen to be so in the past. So it might be that our policies to encourage, as you say, a more equitable distribution of wealth on a world scale might be a way of helping to move away from a foreign policy that encourages these developments. And also the United States might not be so attractive as other places around the world. So in the longer term, people might want to be other places other than here, if you can understand what I mean. That's a long question, but it's a broader question. But the issues are many, and it goes right to the core of the organization of our society. And I'm terribly sorry we want to talk at great length, but we run out of time for this particular segment of the program. I'm very, very sorry that we've run out of time. We go on talking, but could I thank you very much?
Thank you.
And I would remind you again, in the television audience, it's been your pleasure to have the perceptions of Marla Kamiya, who is with the Center for Immigrants' Rights here in New York. Thank you very much. We'll be coming back next week. See you next week. Marla, thanks again very, very much indeed. Good night. See you next week. Sorry.